Hello Internet, I'm Corion, your Witch in Residence, and this has been a video that my channel members have specifically asked for. I put together a poll on long form episodes that they would want to see, and this one is about, is the Prime Directive ethical? And I'm actually going to make the argument that not only is the Prime Directive unethical, but since it is the guiding principle of the Federation, I have questions about the ethics of the Federation now. Now, let's start with what the Prime Directive is. The Prime Directive, at its core, is a belief that we should not interfere in the natural development of younger species or less developed species. That we should not make contact with them until they have reached the point of developing warp drive. This is based on a lot of different factors, the Vulcan Science Directorate and their philosophies, and the fact that the Vulcans didn't contact humans until we had developed warp travel, which kind of set the tone. Now, I'd like to point out that it does not mean FTL communication, and it does not mean necessarily other technologies that are not warp-based. That's an interesting piece, because what if a species travels, say, using recovered technology from the Iconians, where they go from one spot to another spot within a super advanced gateway transporter system, or dimensional shifting, which is a technology we've seen. There's no statement that they would be okay with that. You have to develop warp travel. Now, I've got a few episodes I want to highlight in terms of what I think are the best examples of the Prime Directive. Now, this is by no means a definitive list. This is simply the episodes that I think are the most critical to the discussion of the Prime Directive. If you feel that there are other episodes that also depict information about the Prime Directive that I'm not taking into account here, please bring them up, because I want to discuss them. Okay. I'm going to start with the apple. This is from the original series, Season 2, Episode 5. Now, the idea is as follows. The crew of the Enterprise encounters a primitive planet where the inhabitants live under control of an artificial god that monitors their behavior and keeps them in a state of stasis. The Prime Directive dictates that the crew cannot interfere, but Captain Kirk ultimately decides to intervene by destroying the machine that controls the society, which leads to chaos. Now, why does this matter? Okay. In my opinion, the episode highlights the potential flaw of adhering to the Prime Directive in situations where society is under an oppressive control. By following the non-interference rule, the Enterprise crew would have left an entire civilization in bondage to a machine, unable to evolve or break free. Kirk's decision to intervene, while definitely being morally justified, comes into conflict with the Prime Directive, showing how blind adherence to it can perpetuate suffering. I think it's a valid argument to say, let's start with slavery is bad. Okay. By deciding not to interfere in a species that is keeping another species in that level of oppression, you are effectively saying that this is a natural thing and permissible until they get warp drive, and then they have to know better. But cultural and technological advances don't happen at the same pace. So, an institution of slavery could exist throughout their entire history, and then what do? We have to decide whether this is a cultural position that they're just allowed to keep, and they're allowed to continue causing suffering. That doesn't seem ethical to me, right? My ethics dictate to try to do as minimal harm as possible, and when seeing harm, to try to negate as much as possible. this flies directly in affront to that. So let's move on a little bit and talk about a private little war. The Enterprise discovers a planet where one faction is being armed by the Klingons, tipping the balance of power and escalating the violence. Captain Kirk faces the dilemma of whether to arm the opposing faction, which would violate the Prime Directive, but could prevent genocide, right? Now, again, why do I think this is important? The episode really is a direct critique of the idea of non-interference when the planet's people are being manipulated by external forces. In this case, the Klingons, but it really could be anything, right? The Prime Directive would prevent Starfleet from taking action, but the Federation lacks the intervention risks, allowing the less advanced society to be overwhelmed by violence and war. This episode really defines for me the moral gray area where inaction could result in unnecessary harm, even though the Prime Directive would forbid interference. I think if you could get everybody to agree to the same rule book, a non-interference case could be made. But you're never going to, right? You're never going to convince all the other species that your morals are their morals. So there's always going to be people who are going to uplift the species and take their own advantages from it. All right. The third episode I'm going to bring up is actually from TNG. It's season 4, episode 21, The Drumhead. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, Mike, the Drumhead doesn't have anything to do with lesser species. Hear me out. In this episode, an investigation aboard the Enterprise leads to a trial of a crew member who is suspected of being a Romulan spy, Simon Tarsus. As the investigation intensifies, it morphs into a witch hunt, led by Admiral Satie, questioning the very values of the Federation.
Captain, do you believe in the Prime Directive?
Of course.
In fact, it's Starfleet's General Order Number 1, is it not?
Your point, Admiral.
Would it surprise you to learn that you have violated the Prime Directive a total of 9 times since you took command of the Enterprise? I must say, Captain, it surprised the hell out of me.
Now, while not directly about the Prime Directive, the episode touches on the ethical implications of a rigid system that prioritizes rules over the well-being of individuals. Okay? What do I mean by that? This episode does not directly address non-interference, but highlights how blind adherence to regulations like a Prime Directive can lead to abuses of power and unethical practices. In this case, the Prime Directive of loyalty to the Federation and bureaucratic drive for security outweigh the ethical treatment of the crew members, showcasing how rules can be abused in service of political agendas. Think about it this way. Let's put a planet out there, okay? We'll call it Polaris 4, okay? And there's a primitive species on Polaris 4 that is in danger of being destroyed due to a comet, and they have no way to defend against this. But they have telescopes on it, they know it's coming. Now, the planet happens to be very rich in resources that will not be destroyed by this comet. All it takes is some bureaucrat to say, well, non-interference. I guess we don't have to save this entire species and their culture and their history and, incidentally, their lives. But we can take advantage of the situation to get our ill-gotten gains. This is the problem with it, okay? It allows rules lawyering to a level that shouldn't be permitted. Okay, carrying on TNG, we're going to talk about symbiosis. Now, this is season 1, episode 22. The Enterprise encounters 2 planets, one of which relies on the other for a life-saving drug. The donor planet society is kept in poverty and dependency, but the Enterprise cannot interfere under the Prime Directive. The crew is forced to watch as the dependency continues, despite the moral implications. So, I think this is fairly obvious, right? The Prime Directive is preventing the Enterprise crew from addressing an ethically problematic relationship between the two planets. The episode highlights how non-interference can allow exploitation and suffering to continue. The Enterprise crew knows the relationship is harmful, but is constrained by the directive, which in this case seems to prioritize cultural non-interference over ethical need to help alleviate the suffering and address systemic injustice. Now, I'm going to take it even further. Their solution is to simply not do anything, not fix the drug mule ships, nothing. Which means everyone on that planet is going to have to go through painful, horrifying suffering so that they will be weeded off the drug while new ships are built. How unbelievably wrong that is. When you have the ability to create potentially a synthetic drug that would slowly wean them off the problem, the equivalent of, like, I don't know, methadone, and get their civilization going again, you instead say, well, we can't interfere, so we're just going to screw everyone on that planet? It's not right. It's really not right. And I honestly think that Gene Roddenberry, had he thought through this, especially today, where we are talking about the mitigation of harm as an important issue, would probably revisit this episode. Okay. Number 5, Cogenitor. This is from Enterprise Season 2, it's episode 22. The Enterprise crew encounters a species of three-gendered society, where one genitor, the cogenitor, is treated as inferior and subjugated to reproduction duties alone. When a crew member interacts with the cogenitor and tries to help him, I believe it's Trip, the crew faces a moral dilemma about whether to respect the species' cultural practices or intervene to end what seems like a form of, well, kind of slavery. Now, why it illustrates the flaw. The episode highlights the ethical conflict between cultural relativism and human rights. The Prime Directive would prevent the interference with the society's practices, but the treatment of the cogenitor is clearly unjust. This scenario exemplifies the ethical dilemma of when it is morally acceptable to break the Prime Directive to intervene in situations of clear oppression or abuse, especially when one means to prevent harm. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up this episode in Enterprise, and that the Prime Directive hasn't been written yet, is because this makes a framework, a groundwork for what the Prime Directive would be based on. And the truth is, they have examples of when it's a bad idea. Let's go back to TNG for a little bit and talk about Pen Pals. This is Season 2, Episode 15. Data establishes a communication link with a young girl on a distant planet, but the Enterprise crew learns that the girl's planet is on the brink of destruction due to geological activity. The Prime Directive forbids them from interfering, yet the crew is torn about whether to let an entire planet's population die because of a rule. Now, this episode showcases where the Prime Directive seems callous in the face of imminent disaster, and it really is. The Enterprise crew is faced with a moral crisis. Do they follow a rule that dictates non-interference, or do they break the directive and save millions of lives? Right? Keep in mind, if this was not a TV show, if they had broken the rule, chances are they would be in a position where everyone in that show would face a court-martial, right? So this episode really does challenge the idea that non-interference is always ethically justifiable when it directly conflicts with the preservation of human life, of any life, right? It doesn't reduce harm, it causes it in this case. Now again, this one's a little bit of an outlier, but I do want to bring it up. This is from Voyager Season 2. It's the first episode of the season. It's called The 37s. It's a classic episode. I actually do recommend watching it, because the crew of Voyager discover a group of humans who were abducted from Earth in the 20th century and brought to a distant planet, including Amelia Earhart. While the Prime Directive technically forbids the Voyager crew from revealing their true origins or interfering with the planet's society, the crew struggles with the ethical implications of leaving these humans stranded. Now, the situation raises the question of whether non-interference is ethical when it prevents the Voyager crew from informing the humans of their true origins or helping them reintegrate in modern society, right? These are people from a pre-warp civilization, technically, right? The Prime Directive creates a morally troubling situation here, where people who belong to one society are kept isolated from their home culture, potentially causing harm to their well-being, right? The episode questions whether the directive should always be prioritized over the needs and rights of an individual. Technically, you can make the argument that Khan Singh and his augments should never have been woken up because they are from a pre-warp civilization. And the fact that they were is troubling. Now, to get to one of my favorite series, Deep Space Nine, we're going to go to Season 5, Episode 24. It's For the Cause, right? The episode centers on the Maquis, a group of colonists who are at odds with the Federation. In this context, the Prime Directive is indirectly questioned as the Federation's actions and non-actions affect the lives of various populations, showing how non-interference and political considerations sometimes clash with ethical behavior. It's easy to be an angel in paradise, but these people don't live in paradise. The Prime Directive comes into tension with the real politic of the Federation's dealings with the Maquis. The Deep Space Nine crew is caught in a web of political maneuvering where the ideal of non-interference clashes with the need to confront injustices or help people suffering from the consequences of larger geopolitical conflicts. I feel the episode critiques the ethical implications of prioritizing directives over moral action of individual when, lives are at stake. Really think about it, right? Admiral Nechayev has gone on record of saying just talk to these people and get them on board with resettlement or dealing with the fact that their lives are going to suck.
And what is that?
The Maquis.
The Maquis are a bunch of irresponsible hotheads.
These hotheads are responsible for the bombing of the Bac-Nor.
I'm aware of that, Commander. We never should have allowed those colonists to remain on the Cardassian side of the demilitarized zone.
Well, they're there, Admiral, and they're not leaving.
What about Commander Hudson? He's lived with these people. What's his analysis of the situation?
I'll have to ask him.
You do that. And Commander, I want you to find the Maquis. Talk to them. Remind them that they're citizens of the Federation, that it is imperative that we preserve the treaty with the Cardassians.
A treaty the Cardassians may not be honoring.
Are you questioning Federation policy, Commander?
All I know is that the situation in the demilitarized zone is deteriorating rapidly.
Personally, I think you're overstating the problem. Establish a dialogue with the Maquis. They're still Federation citizens. I'm sure they'll listen to reason. Good luck, Commander.
And I think these episodes overall demonstrate that the Prime Directive, while potentially well-intentioned, can sometimes result in morally questionable outcomes when the needs or rights of individuals or society are put at risk. In cases where harm, oppression, existential threats are present, the refusal to intervene due to non-interference can be seen as ethically problematic, to say the least. The tension between respecting a culture's autonomy and acting to prevent harm or injustice follows through the core of these episodes that I'm showing you, okay? Making them key examples of why the Prime Directive is sometimes portrayed as flawed, a rigid rule that doesn't always account for the complexities of moral responsibility, okay? Many other works of science fiction explore these dilemmas too, and if you don't mind, I want to talk about a few of them. The first one that I can think of right off the top of my head is the Culture series by Iain Banks. Now, the Culture is a post-scarcity, ultra-advanced civilization, which contrasts significantly with the Prime Directive. They don't see any sort of problem there. The culture believes that it is in a moral imperative to assist less advanced civilizations, particularly if they are facing existential threats. But they also respect the autonomy of other species. This is captured in the concept of contact. It's a division of the culture responsible for interacting with other civilizations. However, there's also division known as special circumstances, which sometimes involves more direct and controversial interventions when diplomacy or non-interference is deemed, inadequate, right? See, the culture's philosophy is more interventionist, with the belief that an advanced society has an ethical obligation to prevent harm and promote freedom, even if it means violating a less advanced civilization's autonomy. They apply moral reasoning based on the values of their society, such as the preservation of life, freedom, and fairness, rather than the strict non-interference policy. The book I want to suggest that really summarizes this well is the novel The Player of Games. The culture decides to intervene in a brutal, game-based society where an oppressive political system uses games to enforce power. The protagonist, Jnaru Morat Gelt, is brought in to challenge the system from within, demonstrating the culture's willingness to directly challenge oppressive systems to promote greater freedom and equality. The other one that I'm going to recommend, of course, is The Three-Body Problem. This is I'll shout it a little bit to Skoglioten. In this Chinese science fiction trilogy, the human race encounters an alien civilization known as the Trilocerans, which come from a planet with radically different understanding of survival. Okay? The Trilosan society has no moral compunction about non-interference or respect for other civilizations. Instead, they operate on a cold Darwinian survivalism, where their interests dictate a first contact strategy that includes the invasion and extermination of humanity. So, it's presenting an alien race whose approach to ethical considerations is shaped entirely by a different set of survival values. There is no idealistic Prime Directive. Instead, the aliens prioritize their own survival at the expense of any other species. This, I think, poses questions about whether humans should ever expect to be treated with moral consideration by other civilizations. And I think that is an important point here if we were ever to look at donning something like this. Now, I think the pivotal moment in the series occurs when humanity learns about the existence of the Trilocerans. The concept of mutual understanding or non-interference is irrelevant, as the Trilocerans are intent upon exterminating humanity to ensure their survival. The series contrasts with the idealism of the Prime Directive with the brutal reality of contact between species with vastly different existential needs. If you want to look into this further, I highly recommend reading The Dark Forest Hypothesis. It's basically a summary on why we should absolutely murder aliens first before they have the opportunity to murder us. I'm going to go with The Expanse as well. Okay? In The Expanse, humanity has colonized the solar system, and there is no overarching principle like a Prime Directive to prevent interference. Instead, the various factions, Earth, Mars, and the Belt, often intervene with the affairs of others based on political, economic, and military interests. The presence of an alien artifact that they call the proto-molecule in the series introduces an accidental threat that forces all parties to reconsider their usual approaches to diplomacy and conflict. Again, while there is no Prime Directive, The Expanse grapples with the consequences of human interference on both a micro and macro scale. The discovery of the protomolecule and its ability to create new forms of life and civilizations forces humanity to make ethical choices about whether or not to intervene in alien processes. The series explores the moral consequences of technological discovery, exploitation, and the unintended consequences of interplanetary conflict. If you think about this series as this is what happens when you give a less advanced species a very advanced piece of technology, you can kind of see this as the quandary of the Prime Directive from the other side. Okay? I mean, one key moment in the series I think that exemplifies that is when the protomolecule is used to transform a station into a massive alien structure. This event leads to debates over whether humans should attempt to control the technology or whether they should leave it alone, similar to how Star Trek explores interventionist dilemmas, but with less idealism and more focus on the pragmatic consequences of the action. This one's kind of interesting. This is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Okay? In Le Guin's Hainish cycle, different human colonies have developed in diverse ways due to various environmental, cultural, and historical factors. The Ecumen, an interstellar collective of planets, seeks to establish peaceful relations between these worlds. The Ecumen's goal is not to impose its values or interference in local cultures, but to encourage cooperation and exchange of knowledge and resources. However, its interactions are not purely non-interfering. They actually employ subtle ways of shaping societies, particularly in cases where societies involved are isolating themselves. The real-world example would be something called the McDonald's hypothesis, where countries that have a McDonald's have never gone to war. Right? The exporting of American cultural touchstones tends to give people examples to go by and get them involved in the culture a little more and change their own, right? So the Ecumen are way more nuanced in understanding that there are times when their intervention might be necessary to foster cooperation or prevent harm. The Ecumen values culture exchange, but recognizes that sometimes intervention might be required in a society that's going to go down a harmful path, right? I'm gonna do, I think, a couple of video games too. The one I want to talk about is the Mass Effect series first. In Mass Effect, the players take the role of Commander Shepard, a human soldier navigating a galaxy full of diverse alien species, each with its own cultural history and ethical concerns. But throughout the series, Shepard is faced with choices that involve interacting with these species, sometimes directly intervening in their conflicts or offering assistance, and other times refraining from intervention to respect cultural autonomy. So the game itself actually forces players to decide between action and inaction. Some missions involve helping an alien species that are oppressed or threatened, while others present moral quandaries about whether to interfere in the internal affairs of a species or civilization. Mass Effect directly addresses the consequences of intervention, especially as some species resent human interference, while others are truly grateful for the assistance. I think the best example is in Mass Effect 3, where the player must decide whether to assist the species, the Quarians, in their struggle against the Geth. The Geth are sentient machines they created. Think kind of like Cylons. The player is also forced to decide how far to go to ensure the survival of one species over the other, with consequences for the relationships between species all over the galaxy. These problems echoed the ethical dilemma of the Prime Directive. Should intervention to prevent harm take precedence over respecting the autonomy of other species? The other one I'm going to bring up because P.D. York would hurt me if I didn't, and that's the Knights of the Old Republic, the 2003 video game RPG. Now, it's set in the Star Wars universe, where players can align with the light side or dark side of the Force. The game deals with moral choices related to whether to intervene in the lives of various species and societies, often putting the player in the situations where non-interference or interference has significant consequences. Now, I'm going to say that although the game does not have a direct analog to the Prime Directive, it touches on similar ethical themes through the lens of the Force, which represents balance and respect for natural order in the galaxy. Many quests involve deciding whether to respect the choices and autonomy of other species or civilizations, or whether to force a certain outcome for what is perceived as the greater good. One of the more significant ethical dilemmas in the game comes when a player must choose whether to aid a group of refugees on the planet Taurus, where intervention could improve their lives but potentially destabilize the local power structure. The game also frequently pits the players against the Sith Empire, an aggressive faction that seeks to control other species, raising questions about whether resistance to such control is justified. Okay? Now, if you're interested in exploring these themes deeper for personal reasons, I have several books that will provide insight into the ethical frameworks of interventionism, cultural relativism, and the moral considerations of interacting with other societies or species. We're going to start with The Ethics of Interventions by Brian Oned. Okay, this book specifically focuses on the ethics of intervention in international relations, exploring when it is emotionally and morally justifiable for one country or group to intervene in the affairs of another. It is a comprehensive analysis of the ethical implications of humanitarian interventions, sovereignty, and non-interference. This has a great takedown of Christian missionary work, and I do recommend checking it out for that reason. Okay? I'm also going to recommend Ethics, a very short introduction by Simon Blackburn. Okay? This is a lot easier to get through. It's concise, accessible introduction to ethics that covers the major ethical theories and moral questions that arise in various contexts, including the concepts of rights, duties, and moral responsibility. This book is a great starting point if you want a broad understanding of ethical theory, right? It's where I think you should get started. And if they ever teach a class like History and the Ethics of Moral Philosophy as depicted in Starship Troopers, this should be one of the first books brought in. The third book, The Morality of Freedom by Isaiah Berlin. Okay? Berlin explores the concept of liberty and the tensions between different kinds of freedom and the ethical and political challenges that arise in situations of power and control. He critiques both authoritarianism and overly permissive approaches to freedom. I think Berlin's analysis of freedom and liberty, particularly in relation to individual rights and state interference, offers important philosophical insights into the moral dimensions of intervening in other societies or civilizations. I'm going to suggest The Ethics of Cultural Relativism by Peter R. Jones. Now, this book explores cultural relativism, the idea that moral norms and values are cultural specific and that one cultural's ethical standards should not be imposed on another. Jones examines the implications of this viewpoint in various ethical debates, particularly in relation to globalization, colonialism, and human rights. I'm also going to put this one in here because I feel like if you're a Star Trek fan, you really need to think about this one. Moral Clarity, A Guide for Grown-Up Idealists by Susan Nyman. Nyman offers a modern examination of ethics, combining both philosophical analysis and practical wisdom. The book addresses the complexities of moral decision-making in a world where idealism must be tempered by the harsh realities of political and societal challenges. Okay? She encourages you to figure out your own answers to these things, but to remember why we're getting into these situations, right? I've got an absolute ton of books, and if you guys are more interested in these, I can definitely bring up some more of them, okay? I think that's enough reading for now. Look, with this in mind, I think I've made a fairly good argument that the Prime Directive is not an ethical behavior. If the Prime Directive is not an ethical behavior, and it is the guiding principle on which Starfleet is based, Is Starfleet ethical? Is Starfleet moral? I am going to make an argument that no, they are just as bad as authoritarian, oppressive regimes we've seen. Because they're made up of so many different voices and so many different cultures that don't agree to any given set of ethical standards, because all of them have different cultures, and the idea is to just respect everyone's culture. What happens when it's someone else's culture to, I don't know, eat sentient species? What happens when it's somebody else's culture to keep a slave race, right? What happens if it's their culture to go pillaging and raiding, right? You know, Martok says it best when talking about the Klingon Empire, right? They conquer other species. That's what they're there to do. That is their divine purpose given to them by Kahless. In that regard, they are following their morals. We may disagree with them, but they are adhering to them. How many times have we seen captains violate the Prime Directive because they thought it was the right thing to do to violate it? If the Prime Directive goes in conflict to general human beings' conscience, that's an issue. That's not human. And I think a full examination of the problems in the Federation at some point does need to happen. I don't know if it's something that I would want to see in a series, but I think I'd love to sit down at some point and write a full-on argument about this. Let me know in the comments if we should do a full takedown on why the Federation is evil, and we'll see where we take it from there. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Please drop a like, please recommend it out to friends, let them know that, you know, we're doing these long form videos. I'm going to try to keep doing these for the next little while. If you guys are interested, the next topic we are going to do, I think, is going to be in Star Wars, why the Sith are right. Let me know if that's something you're interested in reading. The other ones that I've got for you is why the Emperor in Warhammer 40k is actually the good guy, despite everyone saying contrary. And we've got one other one that I think is going to be a little bit of a surprise. So thank you very much, guys. Take care. Merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again. Bye, everybody.